welcome. Welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. And welcome to the virtual reading group. Today we are finishing up our reading of this, I hope you think, wonderful book, Men in Dark Times by Hannah Arendt. When we started this book a little over a month ago, or a month and a half ago, we started with the first main essay in the book on Lessing, called Humanity in Dark Times. And we, in a sense, skipped the preface. The preface is only 3 pages, and I didn't want to assign only 3 pages for the first group. And yet we talked about it, and I've mentioned it at times, but I thought as we come to a close here, we'd sort of return to the beginning and talk a little bit about the preface as we're also talking about the book itself. Arendt begins the preface in the first paragraph and says something I think is very true and also very meaningful for the essays we're going to read today on Valdemar Gurion and Randall Jarrell. She says, the people assembled here, namely in this book, could hardly be more unlike each other, and it is not difficult to imagine how they might have protested had they been given a voice in the matter against being gathered into a common room, as it were. Now, I'll come back to this quote, actually, when we talk about Valdemar Gurion, for whom Arendt says that at the core of Gurion's idea of himself was that he had the courage to be friends with people who at first and even at second sight not only have nothing in common, and to discover constantly persons whom only bad luck or some queer tricks of talent has prevented from fully coming to their own. She says that it takes a courage to be friends with people who have nothing in common. I think this is, like so many of the essays here, and certainly the essay on Gurion, somewhat autobiographical on Hannah Arendt's part. She is someone who was friends with wildly different people, was never part of a clique, or if she was, maybe many cliques is a different way to put it. And she really did love and relish being friends with, reading people who were very different, and that is an important part of who she is. The title of the collection, it comes, we've mentioned this a number of times, come from a poem by Bertolt Brecht on die Nachgeborene. It's usually translated to posterity. It literally means on or to those who come after or are born after us. I just want to share my screen for a second and give you the first 1 or 2 stanzas. Whoops, that's not right. Let's see if I can do this. It's not letting me do this for some reason. I don't know what I've done. All right, I'll just read the first 1 or 2 stanzas of this poem.
Roger, do you want me to share it?
If you can, that would be great. For some reason, mine's not letting me share it. Thanks, Sam. I'll give you a second. I don't know which translation you're going to share, so I'll read from whatever one you put up. So this is a poem that really is deeply important for the oh great, this is one of my favorite translations of the poem. It's not a typical translation. You got to go back up to, yeah, and it's by Scott Horton, who's a wonderful writer who often is an editor at Harper's. And he writes, he translates, truly, I live in dark times. An artless word is foolish. A smooth forehead points to insensitivity. He who laughs has not yet received the terrible news. What times are these in which a conversation about trees is almost a crime? For in doing so, we maintain our silence about so much wrongdoing. And he who walks quietly across the street passes out of the reach of his friends who are in danger. So I'm just going to stop there for a second. What are dark times for Brecht? There are times in which a smooth forehead points to insensitivity, right? If we don't have worries, we're insensitive. It's times in which if we talk about beauty, if we talk about nature, right? If you point out to a friend on Facebook a sunset, you commit a crime or almost a crime, for we are being silent about so much wrongdoing. And he who then in the face of crimes walks across the street is silent and passes out of the reach of his friends who are in danger. This is, of course, we see a lot of these ideas very much so in contemporary culture. The idea of silence equals violence, right? Which, I mean, if you've been to a protest in the last week or so, you'll see tons of signs that say things like white silence equals white violence. This is an idea here that Brecht is referring to in this poem. Arendt, I think, means something a bit different than Brecht. What she says is that there have always been dark times. There have always been times of a kind like Brecht describes. But what she means by it more specifically is that in the public world, we know what's happening. We know that there's that darkness is descending in a way. And yet, as she says on page 8, or Roman numeral 8, for until the moment of catastrophe overtook everything and everybody, it was covered up not by realities, but by the highly efficient double talk of nearly all official representatives, who, without interruption and in many ingenious variations, explained away unpleasant facts and justified concerns. The point is, it was like a slow moving train wreck. You see it coming. And yet until the actual crash, people keep talking, and they keep talking and saying things as if the crash was not going to happen. And she says we have to take this camouflage emanating from and spread by the establishment or the system. So the system or the establishment keeps talking, keeps on going, and hides what's really happening, even though everybody sort of knows it. And what does she mean by this thing that's happening, these dark times that are happening? Well, she says Sartre understood it as that everything is opaque and meaningless and obfuscated, and that Heidegger says that everyone just talks and talks as if you're at the water cooler at the office and you talk about sports, or you talk about politics as if it's a game. And we all know what's happening. But the light of the public realm, das Licht der Öffentlichkeit, the light of publicness, verdunkelt alles, darkens everything. I think this raises, I mean, again, wherever your politics lie, you can't but read lines like this of Arendt's and at least have a question in your mind, right? There is a question going on. Are we headed towards a catastrophe? Are we headed towards, as some would say, authoritarianism around the world or in this country, fascism around the world or in this country? And some people say, yes, right, we are. And we need to yell and scream and be aware of it. I mean, Masha Gessen, who writes a lot about Arendt, just published a book basically saying, fascism is coming, and it's almost here. And yet there's other people who say, look, we're living we're very far from fascism right now. And in some sense, you can argue they're both right. I think it's a good argument to say they're both right. And you don't know until it happens, until the moment of catastrophe that overtakes everything. It can go either way. And yet, so Arendt is writing about people who live in such a time, who live amidst this catastrophe, this darkness. And what she says is that even in the darkest times, we have a right to expect some light, some illumination. And again, as I've emphasized a few times, she thinks that this illumination will not come from concepts or theories, won't come from philosophy. It won't come from, highly theoretical, expert analysis. It's going to come from what she calls the uncertain, flickering, and often weak light that some men and women in their lives and their works will kindle under almost all circumstances and shed over the time span that was given them on earth. And so, this book is an assemblage of essays and reviews that Arendt wrote over 12 years. We're going to read today the first one from 1955, the earliest one she wrote on Randall Jarrell. And we're going to read one of the last ones that she wrote on Valdemar Gurion Valdemar Gurion in 1955, and Randall Jarrell in 1967. So one of the earliest and one of the latest of these people who, as she said, could hardly be more unlike and might not have appreciated being in the same volume with each other. So I'll start with Valdemar Gurion. I'll go out on a limb and say most of you don't know who Valdemar Gurion is or didn't. He's probably, with Hermann Brock, the two least known people in the volume. He was born Jewish in St. Petersburg in 1903 to an assimilated and well-to-do family. His mother brought him to Germany. This is all from Arendt's description, where he was baptized and raised a German Catholic. He was a student of two of the great German Catholic scholars, Max Scheler and Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt was also later a Nazi. Both Scheler and Schmitt are critics of liberalism, and to some degree, people who could be seen as, at least looking backwards, and maybe even looking forwards, supporters of more authoritarian kinds of governments in Germany. I mean, Max Scheler, many people know Carl Schmitt, who was a real critic of the Weimar Constitution, and a Nazi. Max Scheler, who was not a Nazi, wrote a book in favor of going to war in World War I, before World War I, in which he said we needed a war because liberal bourgeois society had become so soft and so corrupt, and the only way to, in a sense, revitalize humanity was through the fire of war. And so Scheler was one of those who called for war as a way to restore a kind of human excellence at the time. And he was a leader of a large group of conservative German thinkers who believed in the necessity of war to every once in a while to restore human greatness. She begins the essay on Gurian, who, by the way, taught at Notre Dame for many years. He emigrated to the United States, saying that he was a man of many friends, and that friendship was what made him at home in this world. This is, I think, a theme that at this point we should all be familiar with from this book of essays. Many of the people and many of the essays focus on the concept of friendship. I think in the last few years, there've been a number of books about friendship and Hannah Arendt. I think it's a well deserved new field of study. Friendship was at the very center of who she was, and so much of her thinking is about and through friendship, which is why I'm really excited that when it's back in publication, we're going to read the book of letters between her and Karl Jaspers, who I think was clearly her closest friend over a long period of time, besides her husband, Heinrich Bucher. We get into, though, the key of this essay on Valdemar Gurion on page 251, where she says that he was an extraordinary and extraordinarily strange man. This idea of strangeness dominates this essay. So on 252, she'll say, not his mind, but his person was extraordinary. And there was an odd strangeness of the human man, with the even larger head, the broad cheeks, divided by a surprisingly small, slightly turned up nose. That he was a strange man on 255, everyone must have noticed immediately. And again, strangeness is from a, quote, instinctive movement of both soul and body, of shying away from the world. He was a complete stranger, his strangeness, in the world of things. And he had an open conflict between the humanity of man and the reity, playing on the Latin res, the thing, the thingness of things. And so this idea of strangeness, that he was sort of out of place in the world of things. Why is she emphasizing this strangeness? I think it's because what she wants to say is that his strangeness, as she does say, and I read earlier, is this not of his mind, but of his person. What is this person? It's that aspect of Gurian, or of any person, not reducible to their body and to their job or the typical things that we associate with them. I mean, Hannah Arendt was very critical of the Latin phrase that man is a rational animal, an animal rationes. Why? Because she thought that it, at least in the way it's been interpreted over time, it put too much emphasis on the fact that man was an animal, even though a rational animal. And for Arendt, the animalitas, the fact that man was like an animal, while true, I mean, no one's going to deny that we're not an animal in some way, took away from the essence or the core of being human. And so on page 257 and into 258, she really develops an idea which, again, comes out in many of her works, but I think is important about what she thinks it means to be human. So on 257, she says that his strangeness made him, quote, so very human and sometimes so very vulnerable. She says that to be human is to be more than a thing. She says the greatest prerogative of every man to be essentially and forever more than anything he can produce or achieve, not only to remain after each work and achievement, the not yet exhausted, sheer inexhaustible source of further achievements, but to be in his very essence beyond all of them, untouchable and unlimited by them. It's this beyond. There's a part of the person, of the human, not limited to things and also not limited to our job or our career or our accomplishments. It's to not be in any way judged by worldly standards. She says to be known by achievements or worldly standards, quote, loses the specifically human quality of greatness, of being greater than anything done. And here we reach a topic that is one of the most controversial in all of Arendt's work, this idea of greatness. It comes up again in many places in her work, probably most famously in The Human Condition. And so I just, in The Human Condition on page 205 in the section on action, she will say, in talking about Pericles, the Greek Pericles, who, by the way, died in the Athenian plague, but she'll say of Pericles that unlike human behavior, which the Greeks, like all civilized people, judged according to moral standards, taking into account motives and intentions on the one hand and aims and consequences on the other. So unlike human behavior, which we judge morally, action can be judged only by the criterion of greatness, because it is in its nature to break through the commonly accepted and reach into the extraordinary, where whatever is true and common in everyday life no longer applies, because everything that exists is unique and sui generis. Action breaks through the common and can only be judged by greatness. And it's not moral, right? And we've talked about this again in this group before, that for action for Arendt, which is part of the human condition, can be done by good people and bad people. That's an undeniable consequence of how she views humanity. And what she finds exceptional and extraordinary about Valdemar Gurion is that his strangeness made him so human. What does that mean? That he was both for himself and in judging others, willing to look at the specific human quality of greatness, as she says on page 257. She says true greatness, even in works of art, where the struggle between the greatness of genius and the even greater greatness of man is most acute. So in art, you have the greatness of genius and the even greater greatness of man. So the struggle between these greatnesses appears only where we sense behind the tangible and comprehensible product, the artwork, behind it, a being that remains greater and more mysterious, because the work itself points to a person behind it. So what she says about Gurion is that he had this quality of a person behind his works, someone who was great. He also, she says, chose his friends based on the person, not on their accomplishments, not on who they were, but on their greatness. This is on page 258. And she said, this leads them far beyond conventions and established standards of decency. He was willing to be friends with criminals. Okay, I'm using the word slightly provocatively, which I think is fair because we're about to see that he liked provocation. He was willing to be friends with those who were not good people, as long as they were great. What does that mean? It means that he was friends with people who at first and even at second sight, this is a quote, have nothing in common. That he was friends with people and sought to discover constantly persons whom only bad luck or some queer trick of talent has prevented from fully coming into their own. He was willing to be friends with broken people, people who didn't succeed, and maybe even people who were seen as washed up or outsiders or dangerous, but he saw something in them. And as a result, he saw the person behind, in a sense, the product. She says, to be friends with great persons means to discard systematically, though not necessarily consciously, all the most respectable standards of respectability. You have to be willing to be friends, or not, I mean, you don't have to, but to be this kind of person like Valdemar Gurion, you have to be willing to be friends with unrespectable people. She says, to be a person, quote, leads invariably into a kind of life that will offend many, be vulnerable to many objections, open to frequent misunderstandings. You know, we live at a time in which there's an entire culture of not being friends with people who are offensive, or not being friends with people who disturb, who are not respectable. Gurian, and I would wager to say Arendt, would have a hard time today in our culture, on both the left and the right, I should say. This is not a one-sided view. He was protected, she says, by his mischievous innocence, that his desire to provoke came not from ill will, but from a sense that provocation, being provoked no less than provoking, was essentially a means to bring out to bring out into the open the real and relevant conflicts we are so careful to stifle in polite society. So, I mean, when somebody provokes, why are they provoking? Are they provoking in order to start a fire? Or are they provoking because they want to bring into the open real and relevant conflict? Think about some recent provocations in our society. I mean, for those of you who read the newspaper, there's been one the last couple of days flaming across the internet. Why does someone provoke? Why does someone publish provocative thoughts, right? What's going on? And what she says is, you can do so out of a desire to destroy or to set fire to things, and you can do so out of a mischievous innocence. And she says, in the end, he was a very courageous man, and he needed all his courage to keep his innocence alive. I think that's a beautiful line. Courage, she says, is the political virtue par excellence. This is, again, a theme she comes back to in at least 4 or 5 different essays and books. In order to be political, you have to put yourself out into the world. You have to be courageous and risk injury to both your reputation and to your body. But to him, she says, politics is a battlefield, not of bodies, but of soul and ideas. The last and related part here is that what he dreaded was not personal injury, but embarrassment, and then eventually humiliation. Being, in a sense, exposed as a good person, exposed and humiliated as both a weak but also a good person. And these were the things that he most was afraid of. I'll just quickly talk a little bit about Randall Jarrell. One thing I'll note is that when if you, as I did, the first time I read the essay on Randall Jarrell, didn't really know much about him. I got the impression from reading Arendt's essay that Randall Jarrell was not a very well-known or famous poet. She says, she talks about his obscurity and his resentment for being obscure. For those who don't know, he won the National Book Award for Poetry in 1961 for The Women at the Washington Zoo. He wrote a novel about his time teaching at Sarah Lawrence College called The Pictures from an Institution. He was what we would today call the poet laureate to the Library of Congress. So this is one of the most established and successful poets in the United States in the 20th century. And yet, what she most notices about him, at least on one level, is that he was unhappy in his obscurity. And by the way, for those of you who hang around with poets, this is a common theme of poets, to constantly worry and complain about being obscure. And Arendt says that that's not strange. Almost all poets do it. But that from him, what she realized, she says, over time, is that only slowly did it dawn upon me that he did not want to belong among the happy few who grow fewer and unhappier every day. There was a kind of happiness, or not happiness, a kind of desire for the unhappiness of being obscure in him. For Arendt, what she loves most about Jarrell is his knowledge of the English language. She talks about how it was he who translated her early on when she wrote in The Nation. Of course, by translation, she doesn't mean translated. She means took her halting English and turned it into what she would consider real English. In many ways, he was one of her first and most important English teachers. There were others, Alfred Kazin, Auden, and others. And she says that she would invite him into their home, and he would come and read poetry to her for hours. And she writes, he opened up for me a whole new world of sound and meter, and he taught me the specific gravity of English words, whose relative weight, as in all languages, is ultimately determined by poetic usage and standards. I think I'll just stop there. There's more to say in the Jarrell essay, although it's certainly the shortest and least complicated essay in the book. And let's see where you guys are. If you just to remind ourselves how this works, if you have a question or a comment, raise your hand in the hand raise function, which you can find if you go to I think participants and then more or underneath. I don't have it on mine because I'm a host. So let's see if we get a conversation going. How you guys are thinking about these essays, and it can be about these essays or at this point the book, since we've now finished reading the book. My cursor's not working, so there we go. Are there? Let's see. There's some hands raised. Harold? Sam's going to do it, so I don't have to. Otherwise, we're going to keep going back and forth. I'm sorry. Harold, you have a question or comment?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's just a little aside of may or may not be of interest. On page 266, she says, who was old-fashioned enough to believe, like Goethe, in progress. So I read that, but each night before I go to sleep, I read a little bit currently of Heckman's Conversations with Goethe. And the day that I read this, the evening, I thought it was interesting. The evening reading was, so I repeat, it is absolutely indispensable for the United States. This is February 1827. It is absolutely indispensable for the United States to effect a passage from the Mexican Gulf to the Pacific Ocean, and I'm certain they will do it. Would that I might live to see it, but I shall not. I should like to see another thing, a junction of the Danube and the Rhine. But this undertaking is so gigantic that I have doubts of German resources. And thirdly and lastly, I should wish to see England in possession of a canal through the Isthmus of Suez. Would I could live to see these three great works, it would be well worth the trouble to last some 50 years more for the purpose. It was just interesting to me that I read both of those same things at the same time. That's all.
Yeah. That was Goethe, right? That you're reading from, right?
Yeah, yeah, Conversations with Eckermann.
Yeah, I mean, we all know that Arendt has a mixed, not a strong belief in progress. She has more of a tragic worldview, but it's always nice when those connections of what we're reading come together. So thanks, Harold. Sam, do you want to bring the next person, Amari? Amari?
Yes. Oh, thank you, Roger. Thank you, Sam. So I have a question on the essay of Gurian. What is the meaning of humiliation in Arendt's view, especially on Gurion's view? Because if he was disingenuous enough to confront other people in trying to discover their greatness, to put it one way or another, and go beyond the body, then why the humiliation is such a big thing, or something that stands out both for Arendt and Gurion, especially because you cannot know if everyone is great and can be respectable unless you reach out and maybe humble or humiliate yourself. I don't know what will be the meaning of this word and the way to provoke or to understand or to seek the greatness in the other and so on. Thank you.
I think it's a great question. And I think it's one, dare I say, that is of the absolute moment today. So it's important to see how this question of humiliation comes up in the essay, right? She's talking about his person and how his person is a kind of quality of greatness, and that not only in himself but in others, he was attracted to persons who had this quality of greatness. Thus, he had friends who were unrespectable and who were offensive. And then she says, well, how could he get away with this? How would he not get in trouble? And she says, well, on one hand, he had this like slightly mischievous innocence, and he never really meant any harm. But he had a courage, namely a courage to bring ideas into the battlefield and get people arguing and love the drama of it. And it's here where she says that he had almost an urge to seek out the potentialities for drama. This is on page 259. That she then says he did not do this often. What kept him from it was never lack of courage, of which he had rather too much than too little, but a highly developed sense of considerateness. What he dreaded most was embarrassment, a situation in which he would embarrass somebody or be embarrassed by others. Why did so one question we should ask is, why does he dread embarrassment? In some level, embarrassment is, and if you look at the example that she offers, the prime example is from Dostoevsky's The Idiot. And it's an example in which the prince in The Idiot breaks a vase and feels great remorse for it. It's a expensive vase. And so she says that there's a kind of humiliation both at his clumsiness but also at his goodness, and that he's no longer in control, that there's a way in which he's now a victim of circumstance. And so there's a kind of embarrassment when one is exposed in ways that one didn't want to be exposed. Well, one of the things a provocateur does is he exposes people. He forces them to be public in their nonconformism, right? It's almost like outing somebody, not for sexuality or other things, but for their ideas. And that can be humiliating and embarrassing. And one can also be embarrassed oneself in such a circumstance. It alienates people from the world because they are exposed in their strangeness, something that actually Arendt finds deeply alluring in Gurian, but can be embarrassing if you're strange or awkward or an outsider. And so I think this attunement to embarrassment and humiliation is, on the one hand, a compensation for, or for this courageous need to expose and unveil real disagreements and the urge to unveil real battles and real drama. And it's sort of what protects him from being, just a flamethrower, as we might say. If that helps at all, Amare, maybe I'm happy to have you say something more if you'd like. You got to unmute yourself. Oh, or Sam's going to unmute you. Can we unmute him?
Yeah. Oh, okay. Thank you. No, that's very interesting, especially because, and I'm gonna take on one of the question that Joyce put on in the chat, that she asked that he shows who he provoked, and I just want to take that question to put the other way around. Maybe he was trying to look for greatness in other people, but at the end, did he know that he maybe will be the victim of the provocation, that the other speaker will provoke him, and just he received that surprise by the other? And the other thing is that maybe the embarrassment is something that we cannot avoid, no matter how awake we are regarding our own ideas or secure we are. And I'm gonna put my experience, for example, my own experience. The first time that I entered into the group, I wanted to ask the question, but I just got into an anxiety attack because maybe gonna embarrass myself or something alike. But I wanted to engage into what we were reading and to look for what is the greatness of Arendt, describing all this person that gives life into dark times. So maybe embarrassment is not that bad, or to be exposed, and maybe to build yourself on your exposed persona, and maybe you become more real to yourself. Okay, of course, that is if you want to take that opportunity. Not everyone will take that opportunity to be real in your persona. You keep building on your persona, so on and so on. Well, thank you.
That's great. I don't know how to ask if people have a response to any of the particular questions. You just have to raise your hand, and we can continue. But Sam, do you want to add anything, or do you want to go on?
I'll wait to jump in for a little bit. We have a number of hands up. I have some things to add, but I'll hold off.
Okay.
Jack Hirschfield has his hand up, and then George. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Am I live?
Yes.
Yes.
So this is just a little aside, but I had never read anything before about Randall Jarrell, although he was a subject of attention when I was going to school. He was a very well-known poet, as Roger mentioned. I was at Bard, the chairman of the Lit Club, and we invited lots of poets to come and speak. We never invited Randall Jarrell, although I think everybody admired his poetry. But I would say uniformly, the poets who did come to speak uniformly felt like they didn't like him. They liked the poetry, but they did not like Randall Jarrell. They thought that he was very haughty and that he was not interested in other people's poetry, and that he had some idea of poetry that exalted himself above all others. That was just an impression that I got from one poet after another, many of whom are still alive. And so I was very surprised by this article, by this piece that Hannah Arendt wrote, which illuminated a lot of why people might have gotten that impression, while at the same time changing my picture of him because of the way she speaks about it. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, that's a nice story, Jack. You know, I'll just, you know, I think let's just read the lines Arendt quotes at the end of her piece from his poem entitled "A Conversation with the Devil." He writes, I'll do the best I can reading here. Indulgent or candid or uncommon reader, I've some, a wife, a nun, a ghost or two. If I write for anyone, I wrote for you. So whisper when I die, we was too few. Write over me, if you can write, I hardly knew. That I, but anything will do. I'm satisfied, and yet you were too few. Should I perhaps have written for your brothers, those artful, common, unindulgent others? You know, one could imagine maybe why people didn't like him. I find these lines just extraordinary. But he was, Jack said people found him haughty, condescending. I think he used those words. I can see that in these lines, and yet, also I can see brilliance, genius in these lines. So that's all I have to say. I'll let the poetry speak. Shanima, Sam, you wanna? Yeah. Shanima, you're on.
Hi. My question was more along the lines of Mauri's question. So I was just wondering about her take on Gurion's friendships, right? I felt that she thinks that the way he has made many friendships and the way he has remained loyal to them and all is something which is very good, and it kind of sets an example for everyone. But at the same time, the fact that he doesn't really put out his personal feelings with his friends. Even on page 251, she says, death must have been very familiar to him, right? The fact that he doesn't really put out himself in his friendships with different people, again, it looks like she has a negative take on his friendships, right? The way he makes friendships. So I'm not quite clear if she's supporting his way of making friendships, or she's saying that it's not the right way.
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure about his way of making friendships. She's obviously taken by him as a friend, right? That he made his last trip to Europe because, as he said, I want to say farewell to my friends before I die. He did the same in New York, where obviously they must have had their last meeting. And she does celebrate his faithfulness and his loyalty. I think the part of your question that I find most provocative and exciting, and I'm not sure if it's what you meant, but let me at least say it, and then you can tell me what you think, is your question of how do we, let alone her, judge his idea of friendship? I think this is very much in the air right now. I've said this a couple times, so I'm going to try and be a little more explicit about it. Arendt seems to praise and relish in Gurian, also in people like Lessing and others in this book, the willingness to be friends with people who are different and who would not be friends with each other, right? From the preface, she says the people assembled here could hardly be more unlike each other, and they may have protested at being made to share a common space. About Gurian, she says it means to be friends with people who at first and even second sight have nothing in common. People who are a bit, unrespectable and maybe even offensive. There's an argument going on in this country and around the world about who we should talk to, right? Who should be our friends? Can we be friends with people who are of a political or moral bent that we find offensive? If we judge this on a civilizational level, the answer is no, right? I mean, that's what she says in the Human Conditions. Civilization, society judges on a moral level. But action, she says, is judged by greatness. And she clearly has at least an openness to being friends with people who are great, but different. Now, that doesn't mean that there may not be limits, right? And I think this is a question that a lot of people are asking, right? So what are the limits? At what point do you stop being friends with someone, or do you stop including them in your common room? I mean, as much as Arendt talks about greatness and openness and personality, none of the essays in this book are about people who were morally contemptible, right? She obviously makes choices about who to bring into her room, and I think I'll put as someone who runs a center that often invites people whose views are outside of the mainstream. There's always the question of how do you make those choices. The New York Times this week published an op-ed by a U.S. senator, or one that many consider to be one of the smartest and most educated and most influential U.S. senators currently in Washington. And he's been, they've been accused of bringing someone who was offensive and dangerous into the conversation and into the paper. And so I don't think she answers these questions in this book. I think she gives us, in some sense, certain criteria and certain ways of having a conversation about with whom we can and should be friends, and with whom we can and should share common rooms and a common book. And these are very difficult questions. And I think, we've had to struggle at the Arendt Center. What's our standards, right? Not just anybody, and not just anyone who disagrees with us. Who do we invite, and who are we willing to take heat for inviting? Because at this point, it's going to cause heat. And we've tried to come up with a whole lot of criteria and understandings, and it's not objective. But for us, they have to have a certain following, and we have to think that they're serious. And from our point of view, we have to believe that they're not flamethrowers, that they're actually making legitimate, meaningful arguments, and they're not just trying to cause a stir. But these are hard things to enforce. So I don't know if that's where you were headed with your question, Shanima, or not. But I don't know. Maybe you want to respond at some point to any of that, or rephrase your question if I completely missed it.
No, yes, it answers my question. It's clear. Yes.
Okay. Jennifer, Sam, you want to? I'm going to unmute.
Jennifer, you're unmuted.
Oh, okay.
You're there.
Jennifer, you here?
She might have popped away for a second, so I'll unmute
right.
George.
Okay. George? There we go. George, you there?
I'm here. I'm just trying to unmute.
Yeah, good. You're unmuted.
Hello. Am I unmuted?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, I agree with you on most aspects. I'd like to just direct some questions to one other aspect of Arendt here. These two essays struck me as one of her more, I don't know how to say, Germanophilic essays. And that sort of, she made Gurian sound a lot like a Luftmensch. You know, his head is so much in the cloud that he doesn't pay attention to the practical aspects of life. And in one sense, it sounded good because he made so many friends. In another sense, reminded me of someone else she wrote about it that I'm not going to go into right now. But it was this great man theory who were just too much in the clouds to worry about their practical action. And with Jarrett, again, Jarrell rather, I read again, one of the things, yes, he was a great Germanophile. He loved the language, he loved the culture, and he said, yeah, they did some bad things, but language and culture is great. And this, again, to people of Eastern European backgrounds, a little grating because you start thinking about, you know, even people like Paul Celan and things like that. And the German language is so precious to him that he can't let go of it. That is the most important thing there is. Jean Amory. And it gets a little pretentious and irritating at times. I don't know if it does to other people.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, George. I think that you know, Arendt you know, believes in making judgments, right? A friendship is a judgment, right? It's, I want to spend time with you. I think you're valuable to spend time with for whatever reason, greatness, usefulness, whatever. But one of the things that Arendt says about judgment is that to make a judgment, you have to stand away from somebody to some degree. Nietzsche calls this the pathless of distance. In a way, there's a certain arrogance in making judgments. And one of the things Arendt talks about in many different places is sort of the need to be willing to be a little arrogant, make your judgments. That doesn't mean, you know, you should always assume you're right. I mean, well, you have to think you're right. It doesn't mean you shouldn't listen to other people and try and test yourself. But in the end, you have to make judgments. If you look at Arendt's friends, there's no doubt that most of them come from a similar world of German and philosophical background. You know, there were exceptions, right? Mary McCarthy, and some others, but by and large, she felt most comfortable in that milieu. in the essay we're going to read next week, the first essay it's not an essay, it's an interview, in the Essays and Understanding volume. It's called The Language Remains. And it's about her love of the German language, right? And in the little review of Jarrell that she wrote here, she talked about how for Jarrell, what he loved was not Germany, but German, the language, even though he didn't speak it well. And Arendt, I think, says much the same thing at times. When at one point she says, look, I'm not a communist, I'm not a conservative, I'm not a capitalist, whatever. All I am is I come out, my home was in German philosophy. That's what I come out of, right? And that the world she lives in is one of her friends. You know, I don't think, I guess what I'm trying to say, George, is Arendt is not interested in being seen as or being someone who thinks everyone's equal. At least, yes, in politics, absolutely equal. But, you know, she wants to be with people like herself. This is what, you know, she's a big defender of what she calls social discrimination, not political discrimination. And then one of the questions that people have for her is, where do you draw the line between social and political? You know, but you know, so she does have that kind of willingness to say like attracts like, and she liked people who were part of that, either part of or attracted to that kind of German intellectual milieu.
I just want to add, I
knew you were going to say something to this.
Yeah, well, just on Arendt and friendship, I think, you know, I have a different reading of her position on what you call social discrimination, but, you know, Hannah Arendt drew a distinction in her private life between what she called her tribe, who were the people that she let into her intimate, immediate circle, and her friends, who were a much larger, more expansive group of individuals. And Mendelssohn was her longest and oldest friend from childhood, a descendant of Moses Mendelssohn. One of her best friends after she moved to America, before she ever met Mary McCarthy, was Hilda Frankel, who was Paul Tillich's mistress, and who had a very different kind of life than Hannah Arendt had. And Arendt writes about how, you know, she loved spending time with Hilda because she loved the stories from the different world that Hilda occupied and the different kinds of relationships she had. And her relationship with Mary McCarthy, which is incredibly intellectual, and you see them engaging with ideas. Arendt also serves as marriage counselor to McCarthy's many tumultuous relationships and marriages. Randall Jarrell was a very close friend of hers. And this essay, I think, speaks to that beautifully. The passages where she's describing how she felt she was cast under a magic spell every time he walked into the room, that he had this incredible poetic sensuality and sensibility that performed this kind of, you know, trick. And he, you know, their letters are also quite beautiful. You know, she sent him translations of poems and he sent her translations, and they had a very close relationship that was constellated by Arendt's early publishing career in New York in the late 1940s and early 50s. So she, you know, and then just one more example, after W.H. Auden's death, you know, she had become very good friends with Auden, and Auden was gay, but he proposed to her, and she declined his proposal, in part because he didn't belong to the sphere of intimates. Fun fact I discovered writing the biography, Hans Morgenthau also proposed to Hannah Arendt after Auden died, I found their love letter, his love letters to her, which are quite beautiful, and I'll share them in the book. But she also rejects his proposal because he is not part of her sphere of intimates, and she writes to Mary McCarthy, like, what was he thinking? He's not part of, you know, my tribe. You know, but she called it a tribe, I think, for a reason. This was her family. These people were part of the four walls that she thinks of as the private sphere. These friendships are part of what give us durability in a world of impermanence. And we count on our friends. We count on our friends to be there for us. And Arendt's friends were surely there for her from all corners of the world later in life when she needed them. And we count on friends to tell our stories for us. You know, and in that sense, she wasn't as close to Valdemar Gurion. She had a more professional relationship with him than she had with Randall Jarrell. But even in her telling of his story, she's talking about his incredible appetite for life. And this is what drew her to him. He was a man of appetites, and Arendt liked people with appetites. People who were devourous, to understand the complexity of the human condition. And, you know, it's a beautiful, you know, beautiful description. I think also a mirror for Arendt's own position toward the world as one of wonder, as one of hunger. And so I'll stop there. I think there's,
Great.
Oh, just one more,
Yeah.
two more fun facts. One, this book in German, if you read German, came out from Pieper a couple years ago on Arendt and friendship, which is a really great volume with some of the letters from her closest friends that give you a nice kind of introduction to Arendt on friendship. And the Randall Jarrell book on, Letters from an Institution, is actually a fictionalized account of Hannah Arendt and Heinrich Blücher's marriage while Blücher was teaching at Bard. So good summer beach read.
Excellent. Just one other friend to mention that sort of fits this, as Sam was saying, how Arendt had a wide circle of friends who were not always in a particular model of the German intellectual, is Erich Hofer, who is the, I think, stevedore, right? The dock worker who Arendt befriended when she was teaching at the University of California, Berkeley, and said was the only real intellectual that she met in the year she was in Berkeley. And his work is fascinating. Again, so another kind of a friend she imagines. Anita, I've unmuted you. You're ready to go.
Yeah, thank you. I want to ask the three interrelated questions. In the preface, she talks about talk almost as if it's babble. It covers over everything, the inefficiency, the darkness that comes from too much talk. In the final page on Jarrell, which I absolutely loved, she talks about how she found his laughter so exactly right. And she says, how, after all, could any of the learned or sophisticated rubbish about adjustment hope to survive this one sentence of his? President Robbins was so well adjusted to his environment that sometimes you could not tell which was his environment and which was Robbins. If you can't laugh away the rubbish, what hope is there? And I was thinking that what she's talking about here is humor and the power of humor. And what I wanted to ask is, what role, how does humor relate to power and strip away power? What is this courage that she talks about, this immense courage that he had in his laughter and his humor? And then rather with an extraordinary pathos in that last paragraph, she says, when I last saw him, not long before his death, the laughter was almost gone and he was almost ready to admit defeat. It's almost as if energy has a power, a life energy for the individual. And I wondered if you could talk about how she thinks about humor and laughter in these ways.
Yeah, that's a great great series of questions. I'm going to mute you simply because there's some background noise, Anita, but if you want to come back, you can. You know, laughter certainly plays a role in Arendt's writing. Often not as on the level of scorn or contempt as it sometimes can, but in the question of reconciliation. So reconciliation, which is a major theme in her work, sort of hidden at times, a reconciliation with the world, a love of the world, being able to laugh allows you to, in a sense, express gratitude for the world, even in its horror and its tragedy. We've talked. We just read the book on Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem before we read this one, and we talked a lot about her irony and her sort of finding him to be a buffoon and a laughable creature, and how people criticized her for this. But for her, you could almost only laugh at times at Eichmann. And so, I mean, I don't have any perfect answers to what you said, but when she says, as you rightly said here, that before his death, his laughter was almost gone. It's almost like when your laughter's gone, you can no longer bear the world. You can no longer love the world. You've lost that ability to do so. And so that's what it makes me think about. The line you read from Pictures from an Institution is just, I mean, is perfect, right? President Robbins was so well adjusted to his environment that sometimes you could not tell which was the environment and which was President Robbins. You know, I think what she's saying is, look, we all know people like this. In fact, most of the world is like this. All of us are like this to some degree. All of us adjust. And if you can't laugh at it, and if you can't laugh away the rubbish, you can't live in the world. You have to be able to reconcile yourself to some degree to our weaknesses, our embarrassments, our failures, and to the tragedy. That doesn't mean you don't give up trying to change it. Doesn't mean you don't still make judgments, but you do have to be able to laugh. I don't know, does that help, Anita? Do you want to add anything?
No, that did help. Thank you very much.
Okay.
I've got nothing more to add.
Okay. There's a bunch of questions still. Jennifer Lee had a question, I think got cut off. I'm going to unmute Jennifer because she was, whoops. Are you there, Jennifer? Oh, she's she muted?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm here.
Oh, actually, I can barely hear you. You're in and out.
Oh, okay. Hang on 1 second.
No, now it's better, Jennifer. So.
Okay. I love this essay so much, and I loved reading about him. But what struck me was this line: provocation, being provoked no less than provoking, was essentially a means to bring out into the open the real and relevant conflicts we are so careful to stifle in polite society, and that he could break down these barriers of so-called civilized society. I'm actually finding doing something like that to be very difficult these days, because I find that even though I find that there are so many barriers that we can't engage with somebody on the other side of the aisle, so to speak, that it feels very tight. and not free flowing at all. And I was
Yeah.
wondering if you could comment on that.
Well, I mean, I said something a little bit earlier. I don't know if you were on. You know, I think that's right. You know, I have, as someone who's been described in many different venues as a provocateur, you know, I'm acutely aware of the precarious nature of being a provocateur. I think at all times, but certainly right now. And what I said before when I was talking about how we make decisions at the Arendt Center about whether to bring someone to talk, you know, I think to me, one of the main criteria, aside from the fact that they can't be, they have to have a following, they have to have some importance or meaning, you have to have, there's be a reason to bring them, is that they're not a flamethrower. And what I mean by that is they're actually arguing because they believe sincerely in what they're doing, and they're not simply doing it to provoke. They're actually doing it, and not simply doing it to anger or upset. Now, I mean, I will say that people who simply throw bombs are actually useful in society because they remind us of our conformism and remind us of our intolerance. And sometimes you have to throw bombs. But the Arendt Center, you know, as I see it, is a public institution that has a certain mission, which is to think. And so and in conversation with Samantha and others, have sort of developed this idea of, you know, if we're going to bring someone, we have to think that not only are they provocative, and not only do they have a certain base, but they are thoughtful and in some way sincere, and that their ideas have some, you know, have a reason to be heard. You know, these are all subjective criteria. But so Jennifer, to sort of try and answer your question, you know, the cancel culture, the unwillingness to hear views. I mean, you know, I'll just use the example that's in the press right now. Tom Cotton, who's again a very well respected by certain people. I mean, I don't know him any at all, but people who know him, very smart, good history, very powerful senator, writes an op-ed in the New York Times, making an intellectual argument, I think, for, in a sense, President Trump's argument that we should bring in the military to address the protests. I think it's certainly an argument I fundamentally disagree with. But in general, I think it's an argument that is intellectually coherent and needs to be argued against rather than simply suppressed. But there have been a number of interesting arguments against the Times publishing it that I've come across, right? One is that it endangers the Black people who work for the Times. You know, that's the one that unfortunately or not, I got 60 tweets about yesterday because it seemed like every Times reporter and their friends were cutting and pasting it. I didn't find that persuasive as an argument. I don't think it does, but we can have that conversation. And I thought it was more of a, you know, we don't want to have to deal with things that make us unsafe. I mean, there's the question of physical safety and who would be subject to such physical safety or physical danger if the army came in. I understand that. But there's another argument that, you know, I think is going around, which is that we're, as Hannah Arendt says, we're in dark times. We're facing a catastrophe. And catastrophes sort of go along, and then they happen. And, you know, for some people, you know, we're at a moment in which an authoritarian moment in the world with an authoritarian president who certainly seems to have some authoritarian leanings, who, you know, facing a pandemic and a loss of popularity and a coming election and a protest movement. I think there's some fear from some people that this could be a moment to use to mobilize the military in a way that would be deeply undemocratic and potentially catastrophic for the constitutional system. Now, you know, I may or may not agree with that worry. You know, I think it's a long shot, but I don't want to completely discount it. But my opinion is irrelevant here. The point is, if you have that worry, and if it's a legitimate worry, should you, you know, bring him into your room? Should you publish him? You know, and I think there's at that point, it becomes almost a tactical question, right? You know, tactically, you can say, well, by bringing him in, you legitimate his viewpoints and you make it possible that it might happen. On the other hand, by excluding him, you give him and all his supporters a further sense of resentment against the establishment. That even though he's the president or Trump is the president, they consider the liberal establishment the establishment, and thus you create an even deeper sense of justification for burning the system down. You know, those are tactical issues. I think they can be argued tactically on either side. You know, whether you're willing to go to the mat on the principal issue, which is simply that all sides should be heard, is another option, right? To be an idealist on those levels. You know, I certainly err on the side that all sides should be heard, but I think every institution, be it the Hannah Arendt Center or the New York Times, has to make its own decisions and criteria about who to hear. What I've been shocked about with the Times is simply that they seem to have had no serious discussion about what the criteria is for who to publish. I mean, they seem completely unable to explain to themselves or their reporters or to the public how they made the decision, which is somewhat disturbing. But
it was broken, by the way, in the past hour that the New York Times.
What'd you say?
It was broken in the last hour, by the way, that the New York Times pitched the op-ed to Tom Cotton. They asked him to write it.
Oh, I didn't even know that. That just happened. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, you know, and by the way, I mean, I'm not, again, I think if I'm the New York Times and you know, you're having a debate where the president of the country is saying, bring in the army, and generals are getting up and saying, this is a disaster. It's not a terrible idea from my point of view to bring someone in who's serious to articulate the intellectual grounds for that argument. I mean, I think it depends on how you see the paper, right? Is the paper a room in which the whole country can have discussions, or is the paper a resistance paper that will make its case? I mean, I'm sure there's other ways to frame it as well. So anyway, Jennifer, that's a very maybe too long winded response to your question. I think it's very hard to make these decisions and determinations of who to engage in conversation, and we're seeing how hard it is today. I don't know if you want to say anything.
Yes. No, thank you. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. I mean, you answered my question. You elaborated. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you. Nancy?
Yeah, I had an earlier question about, it was that when Hannah Arendt is in the moment and is engaging with a friend like Randall Jarrell or Gurian or Hermann Brock, for instance, when she's in that moment, I'm not certain that she's exercising the same kind of judgmental, discriminating act as when she is reflecting back on the whole life of a friend. So I kind of wanted to comment on that. And then I wondered if any of the individuals in this book were still alive when she published the book and reacted to her way of characterizing them in the essays. And I had a third question, if I could just, yeah, go ahead.
Carl Jaspers was alive. I mean, she gave the speech, with him in the audience.
Right.
I don't. The Isaac Dinesen essay was published in after she died. Obviously the others are, I believe, all written after the death of the person. So only Carl Jaspers was alive.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then I had a sort of another question, is that it seems as if her openness to dialogue and to giving the other space as a general principle possibly allows for the individual not to be totalizable or not to be put into a tight system, but inconsistencies within the individual seem to survive and be part of what she's reflecting on, but she doesn't seem to force them into some kind of unified assessment. So I just wanted your comment.
I think that's really perceptive. I mean, one of the reasons Hannah Arendt is so open is that she does believe that reality is complicated. The world is complicated and it's deep. And she thinks all of us have a simple perspective, all of us. And the only way we can become at home in the world is to complicate our perspective. And that means to encounter people who disagree with us. We can then judge them, but we still have to encounter them. And we don't do it because we owe it to them. And we don't do it because, of some marketplace of ideas that we're going to find the truth. She's not a believer in the truth in these ways. We're not going to get there. So she's not a believer in the marketplace of ideas. You do it because you want to live in the world, and the world is complicated, and the world is open, and that means we have to augment and pluralize our perspective, and as she says, the basic condition of the public world is plurality. People are different, unique, plural. And the only way we can be adequate to that world is by actually listening to those who are fundamentally different in their perspectives than us. And that's where she comes down. I'm going to take one more question from Jenny Lynn Bader. Unmute her. You want to ask a question?
Yeah, so I already asked it in the chat, but these chapters struck me as so different from everything we read before. You were quoting the passage that it remains the greatest prerogative of every man to be essentially and forever more than anything he can produce or achieve. And it seems that in all the earlier chapters, there's just so much emphasis placed on action, on what you do in dark times. We should judge people on their deeds. And more than that, we should judge people for how they behave in the most unfortunate of circumstances. And we see that in the chapters on the Pope and on Jaspers and in Luxembourg. and in her other books. But in these last two chapters, there seems to be this counterpoint, this counter theme that who we are is distinct from our deeds, and not necessarily in a negative way. She tells us that Valdemar Gurion was more than what he did, and that Randall Jarrell would have been a poet if he had never written a single poem. So regardless of what we make or do, there's a potential for something there. And I'm just interested, you talked about it in terms of greatness before, but I'm just sort of interested in this idea of being or having an essence that is somehow valuable, and how she connects that to her understanding of judgment.
Great, thank you. I think the essay that's closest to this one is the essay on Jaspers. I think it's the first essay on Jaspers, where she talks about the fact that the award that Jaspers is getting is awarded to him as a person. Mm-hmm. That he, having proved oneself in life, in die Bewährung in tätigen und erlittenen Leben, so in active and suffered life, and she says that she quotes Cicero and says that all things were brought into relation to the dignity of persons, and she then talks about the greatness and dignity of a person, not and we don't know this through experts or scholars, but only through the judgment of the public. The public knows. And she talks then about this idea of the Socratic Daimon, this demon, this demonic figure that sits on your shoulder, she says, and is not recognized by you so much by others. And it's that daimon is your personality, your character, your persona. And remember, she says it's never acquired in solitude, and never only in one's work, but by venturing into the public realm. And she calls it humanitas. And in his case, it was that he stood alone. And I think in Gurion's case, that persona, that daemon, that his humanitas, comes from his venture into the public, insofar as he provokes and has friends and becomes this person who brings a certain standard of judgment, of greatness into the public. So you said that she talks a lot about achievements and other things. I mean, and that's true. I mean, although with the Benjamin essay, I mean, it starts off with this whole meditation on posthumous fame, right? That you almost, it's and the posthumous fame in some ways is the best kind, because it doesn't affect you when you're living, and it's based on an assessment of you, your person, and your works afterwards. This idea of the person is, I think, quite deep in Hannah Arendt, and it comes back to one of her, one of her main themes, which is immortality. That for her, to be human is to be mortal, but it is to strive after immortality. And what she says is that there are different ways to achieve immortality, but doing great deeds, creating a persona that is separated from your body and your deeds, that stories are told about, is what will lead you to be immortal. And that's important, because being immortal means that you have contributed to the public world. And so for her, and it's also what makes you human, for her to act in ways that are and deserve to be remembered is a criteria for humanity. Again, this is a part of her work that really rubs many people the wrong way, because it opposes the idea of a kind of full-on social equality. She really does think that greatness is part of that the striving for greatness is an essential part of what it means to be human. And I think all of these figures that she writes about are people who did that, who strove in some way to be different, to do something new and original and unique in the world, and to be unique in the world. And that's what allows them, not through their theories or not through their works, but through their person, to shed light and to illuminate dark times. So I take that to be in a way, the point of the book. So maybe a good place to end. Sam, do you want to make a final comment?
No, I think that's a good place to end. We're about 10 minutes. We're about.
Oh,
10
we're
minutes.
over. I'm sorry. I didn't realize that.
I think it's a great question, Jenny Lynn, and I think it's a topic we'll come back to in the essays we're reading in the new book. So thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. I'm very excited to read. In a lot of ways, it's one of those books I'm surprised we haven't read. There's some fantastic essays and texts in Essays and Understanding, including the first one, which is probably one of her most famous documents at this point, this interview that she did. So let's all meet again next Friday and talk about the language that remains. I look forward to seeing you then, and enjoy reading, or in this case, listening to Hannah Arendt. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Roger.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Roger.
Thank you. Bye, Bob. Bye, Allison. It's funny, now that you're all muted, I don't get to see who's here so much anymore, so it's nice to see it now.
I have to go, leave.
Sam, I think that in the future, what we can do is, as people start speaking, we can start unmuting some people and leaving them unmuted so they can participate when they can mute and unmute themselves.
Yeah, that's fine, but somehow you activated a control today that wouldn't let me unmute people as one of the preferences, so I could only request to unmute people. So in the future, you have to make it so that the co-host can also unmute people.
I have a new computer, and it also wouldn't let me share my screen, and it said I had to go into my preferences when I tried to share my screen. So I'm gonna have to figure that out. My computer busted this week, and I got a new computer, so I have to. I got to figure that out. So I'll work on that.
A couple, I think, so the reading, is Craig gonna send around a PDF for the interview with Gunter Gauss for next week in the email? It's online.
We'll send the link, and we can send a link to the PDF. I'd rather not be sending the PDF itself. Is the PDF online or just the interview?
The interview is online. I've never seen a PDF of it. It's available in this volume and the portable Hannah Arendt, and then the text for the interview is available if you Google around.
Yeah, I mean, Craig found the portable Hannah Arendt version online, or Tina did.
Yeah.
And we got a PDF. We made a PDF of it, but maybe we can just send around the link to where they found it, and people can do it on their own.
Well, it's less than, I mean, it's not, I don't think it would be in violation of anything because it's for educational purposes, and it's less than X percentage of the book. It's only like 20 pages out of a 300-page book, but.
Okay. We'll send it then. I'll tell them to send it. That's fine.
I think it's like 10, yeah. I can't remember what the percentage is, but you can check if you're worried about it. I mean, it's for educational purposes. That's usually included.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Okay.
Hi, Harold. See you there. Susan. I don't know who else is here.
I have to jump off because I have a meeting, but I will talk to you soon.
Good. All right. You're feeling better, it looks like. Thank you.
I am. Just the straight cough. I'm fine. I'm doing good. I protested the other day. So
yeah, I know. I saw. I was there on Tuesday with Madeline.
Oh, good.
Yeah. All right. I'll see you soon.
Bye.
Bye.